Well, hey, good evening, everybody. How are we all tonight? Looking pretty good. Not quite as many of us here tonight, and I guess that's just a sign of the times. We come and we go. Must have had other things to do tonight, but I do have some more story I want to talk to you about, so get yourself something nice and warm to drink and get comfortable. And let me tell you some more of this nice book we're reading by Max Brand about the Untamed. That's getting good. So we're starting on chapter 21, One Way Out. In a room of the Sultan place, on the evening of the next day after Calder's death, sat Silent, with Kilduff, Reinhardt, and Jordan about him. Purvis was out scouting for the news of Haynes, whose long absence commenced to worry the gang. Several times they tried to induce Kate to come out and talk with them, but she was resolute in staying alone in the room which they had assigned her. Consequently, to while away the time, Bill Kilduff produced his mouth organ and commenced a dolorous ballad. He broke short in the midst of it and stared at the door. The others followed the direction of his eyes, and they saw Black Bart standing framed against the fading daylight. They started up with curses. Reinhardt drew his gun. "Wait a minute," ordered Silent. "Damn it," exclaimed Jordan. "Don't you see Whistlin Dan's wolf? If the wolf's here, Dan isn't far behind." Silent shook his head. "If there's going to be any shooting of that wolf, leave it to Hal Purvis. He just naturally set his heart on it. And Whistlin Dan ain't with the wolf. Look, there's a woman's glove hanging out of his mouth. He picked that up in the willows, maybe, and followed the girl here. Watch him." The wolf slunk across the room to the door which opened to Kate's apartment. Kate threw the door open, cried out at the sight of Bart, and then snatched up the glove he let drop at her feet. "No cause for getting excited," said Silent. "Whistlin Dan ain't coming here after the wolf." For answer, she slammed the door. At the same moment, Hal Purvis entered. He stepped directly to Silent and stood facing him with his hands resting on his hips. His smile was marvelously unpleasant. "Well," said the chief, "what's the news? You got eloquent eyes, Hal, but I want words." "The news is plain hell," said Purvis. "Haynes, what of him?" "He's in Elkhead." "Elkhead?" "Whistlin Dan got him at Morris's place and took him in along with the body of Tex Calder. Jim, you got to answer for it to all of us. You went to Morris's with Lee. You come away without him, and you let him stay behind to be nabbed by that devil, Whistlin Dan." "Right," said Kilduff, and his teeth clicked. "Is that playing fair?" "Boys," said Silent solemnly, "if I had knowed that Whistlin Dan was there, I'd have never left Haynes to stay behind. Morris said nothing about Calder having a running mate. Me and Haynes was in the upstairs room, and just about supper time, up came a feller and told us that Tex Calder had just come down into the dining room. That was all. Did Whistlin Dan get Lee from behind? He got him from the front. He beat Lee to the draw so bad that Haynes hardly got his gun out of its leather." "The feller that told you that lied," said Silent. "Haynes is as fast with his shooting iron as I am, almost." The rest of the outlaws nodded to each other significantly. Purvis went on without heeding the interruption. "After I found out about the fight, I swung toward Elkhead. About 5 miles out of town, I met up with Rogers, the deputy sheriff at Elkhead. I thought you had him fixed for us, Jim." "Damn his hide, I did. Is he playing us dirt now?" "A frosty morning in December was nothing to the way he talked." "Cut all that short," said Reinhardt, "and let us know if Rogers is going to be able to help the lynching party away from Haynes." He thinks it can be done in a couple of days," said Purvis, "but the whole range is rising. All the punchers are riding into Elkhead and wanting to take a look at the famous Lee Haynes. Rogers says that's when enough of them get together, they'll take the law into their own hands, and nothing can stop them then." "Why don't the rotten dog give Haynes a chance to make a getaway?" asked Silent. "Ain't he paid him his share ever since we started working these parts?" "He don't dare take the chance," said Purvis. "He says the boys are talking mighty strong. They want action. They've put up a guard all along the jail, and they say that if Haynes gets loose, they'll string up Rogers. Everyone's wild about the killing of Calder. Jim, old Saunderson, he's put up $5,000 out of his own pocket to raise the price on your head." "And this Whistlin Dan," said Silent. "I suppose they's making a hero out of him?" "Rogers says every man within 10 miles is talking about him. The whole range will know of him in 2 days. He made a nice play when he got in. You know they's 5,000 out on Haynes Head. It was offered to him by Rogers as soon as Dan brought Lee out. What do you think he done? He pocketed the check? No. He grabbed it and he tore it up small. 'I ain't after no blood money,' he says. 'No,' said Silent. 'He ain't after no money. He's after me.' Tomorrow they bury Calder. The next day Whistlin Dan will be on our trail again, and he'll be playing the same lone hand. Rogers offered him a posse. He wouldn't take it. They's one pint that ain't no near being solved," said Bill Kilduff in a growl. "And that's how you're going to get Haynes loose." Silent took one glance around the waiting circle. Then he nodded. "It's up to me. Give me a chance to think." He started walking up and down the room muttering. At last he stopped short. "Boys, it can be done. They's nothing like talking of a woman to make a man turn himself into a plumb fool, and I'm going to make a fool out of Whistlin Dan with this here girl Kate." "But how in the name of God can you make her go out and talk to him?" said Reinhardt. "Son," answered Silent, "they's just one main trouble with you. You talk a hell of a pile too much. When I'm done, this'll all tell you how I figured out." Well, Chapter 22, The Woman's Way. It was a day later in the morning that a hand knocked at Kate's door and she opened it to Jim Silent. He entered, brushing off the dust of a long journey. "Good morning, Miss Cumberland." He extended a hand which she overlooked. "You still busy hating me?" "I'm simply surprised that you've come in here to talk to me." "You look as if you see something in my face," he said suspiciously. "What is it, dirt?" He brushed a hand across his forehead. "Whatever it is," she answered, "you can't rub it away." "I'm thinking of giving you a leave of absence if you'll promise to come back." "Would you trust my honor?" "In a pinch like this," he said amiably, "I would. But here's my business. Lee Haynes is jailed in Elkhead. The man that put him behind the bars and the only one that can take him out again is Whistlin Dan. And the one person who can make Dan set Lee loose is you. Savvy? Will you go and talk with Dan? That wolf of his would find him for you." She shook her head. "Why not?" cried Silent in a rising voice. "The last time he saw me," she said, "he had reason to think that I tried to betray him because of Lee Haynes. If I went to him now to plead for Haynes, he'd be sure that I was what he called me, Delilah. Is that final?" "Absolutely." "Now get me straight. They's a crowd of cowpunchers gathering in Elkhead, and today or tomorrow they'll be strong enough to take the law into their own hands and organize a little lynching bee. Savvy?" She shuddered. "It ain't pleasant, is it? The picture of a big, good-looking Lee dangling from the end of a rope with the crowd around taking pot shots at him? No, it ain't. And you're going to stop it. You're going to start from here in 15 minutes with your hoss and this here wolf, after giving me your promise to come back when you've seen Whistlin Dan. You're going to make Dan go and set Lee loose." She smiled in derision. "If Dan did that, he'd be outlawed." "You won't stir?" "Not a step." "Well, kid, for everything that's happened to Lee, something worse will happen to someone in the next room. Maybe you'd like to see him." He opened the door and she stepped into the entrance. Almost opposite her sat old Joe Cumberland, with his hands tied securely behind his back. At the sight of her, he rose with a low cry. She turned on Big Silent and whipped the 6-gun from his hip. He barely managed to grasp her wrist and swing the heavy revolver out of line with his body. "You little fiend," he snarled, "drop that gun or I'll wring your neck." "I don't fear you," she said, never wincing under the crushing grip on her wrists. "You murderer." He said calmly, repossessing himself of his gun, "Now take a long look at your father and repeat all the things you was just saying to me." She stared miserably at her father when Silent caught Kate's hand. Cumberland had started forward, but Kilduff and Reinhardt held him. "What is it, Kate?" he cried. "What does it mean?" She explained it briefly. "This is Jim Silent." He remained staring at her with open mouth, as if his brain refused to admit what his ear had heard. "There ain't no use asking questions and how and why she's here," said Silent. "This is the pint. Lee Haines is behind the bars in Elkhead. Whistlin Dan put him there, and maybe the girl can persuade Dan to bring him again. If she don't, then everything the lynching gang does to Haines we're going to do to you. Get down on your knees, old Cumberland, and beg your daughter to save your hide." The head of Kate dropped down. "Untie his hand," she said. "I'll talk with Dan." "I knew you'd see reason," grinned Silent. "Just 1 minute," said Cumberland. "Kate, is this Lee Haines one of Silent's gang?" "He is." "And Dan put him behind the bars?" "Yes." "If Dan takes him out again, the boy'll be outlawed, Kate." "Cumberland," broke in Kilduff savagely, "here's your call to stop thinking about Whistlin Dan and begin figuring for yourself." "Don't you see?" said Kate. "It's your death these cowards mean." Cumberland seemed to grow taller. He stood so stiffly erect with his chin high like a soldier. "You shan't make no single step to talk with Dan." "Can't you understand that it's you they threaten?" she cried. "Understand it all," he said evenly. "I'm too old to have a young man damned for my sake." "Shut him up," ordered Silent. "The old fool." The heavy hand of Terry Jordan clapped over Joe's mouth, effectively silenced him. He struggled vainly to speak again, and Kate turned to Silent to shut out the sight. "Tell your man to let him go," she said. "I will do what you wish." "That's talking sense," said Silent. "Come out with me and I'll saddle your hoss. Call the wolf." He opened the door, and in response to her whistle, Black Bart trotted out and followed them out to the horse shed. There the outlaw quickly saddled Kate's pony. He said, "Whistlin Dan is sure heading back in this direction, 'cause he's got an idea I'm somewhere near. Bart will find him on the way." Silent was right. That morning Dan had started back towards Gus Morris's place, for he was sure that the outlaws were camped in that neighborhood. A little before noon he veered half a mile to the right towards a spring which welled out from the hillside, surrounded by a small grove of willows. Having found it, he drank and watered Satan, and took off the saddle to ease the stallion and lay down at a little distance for a 10-minute siesta, one of those half-wakeful sleeps, the habit of which he had learned from his wolf. He was roused from the daze by a tremendous snorting and snarling and found Black Bart playing with Satan. It was their greeting after an absence, and they dashed about among the willows like creatures possessed. Dan brought horse and dog to a motionless stand with a single whistle, and then ran out to the edge of the willows. Down the side of the hill rode Kate at a brisk gallop. In a moment she saw him and called his name with a welcoming wave of his arm. Now she was off of her horse and running to him. He caught her hands and held her for an instant far from him, like a starving to draw out the note of happiness into a song. They could not speak. At last, "I knew you'd find a way to come." "They let me go, Dan." He frowned, and her eyes faltered from his. "They sent me to see you, to ask you, to free Lee Haines." He dropped her hands, and she stood trying to find words to explain, and finding none. "To free Haines," he repeated heavily. "It is Dad," she cried. "They have captured him, and they are holding him. They keep him in exchange for Haines. If I free Haines, they'll outlaw me. You know that, Kate." She made a pace toward him, but he retreated. "What can I do?" she pleaded desperately. "It is for my father." His face brightened as he caught at a new hope. "Show me the way to Silent's hiding place, and I'll free your father and reach the end of this trail at the same time, Kate." She blenched pitifully. It was hopeless to explain. "Dan, honey, I can't." She watched him miserably. "I've given them my word to come back alone." His head bowed. Out of the willows came Satan and Black Bart and stood beside him, the stallion nosing his shoulder affectionately. "Dan, dear, won't you speak to me? Won't you tell me that you try to understand?" He said at last, "Yes, I'll free Lee Haines." The fingers of his right hand trailed slowly across the head of Black Bart. His eyes raised, and he looked past her, far across the running curves of the hills, far away to the misty horizon. Kate? Dan, you do understand. I didn't know a woman could love a man the way you do, Lee. When I send him back to you, tell him to watch himself. I'm playing your game now. But if I meet him afterwards, I'll play my own. All she could say was, will you listen to me no more, Dan? Here's where we say goodbye. He took her hand, and his eyes were as unfathomable as a midnight sky. She turned to her horse, and he helped her to the saddle with a steady hand. That was all. He went back to the willows, his right arm resting on the withers of Black Satan, as if upon the shoulder of a friend. As she reached the top of the hill, she heard a whistling from the willows, a haunting complaint which brought the tears to her eyes. She spurred her tired horse to escape the sound. Chapter 23. Hell Starts. Between twilight and dark, Whistlin Dan entered Elkhead. He rose in his stirrups, on his toes, stretching the muscles of his legs. He was sensing his strength. So the pianist, before he plays, run his fingers up and down the keys and see that all is in tune and the touch perfect. Two rival saloons faced each other at the end of a single street. At the other extremity of the lane stood the house of Deputy Sheriff Rogers, and a little farther down was the jail. A crowd of horses stood in front of each saloon, but from the throngs within there came hardly a sound. The hush was prophetic of action. It was the lull before the storm. Dan slowed his horse as he went further down the street. The shadowy figure of a rider showed near the jail. He narrowed his eyes and he looked more closely. Another horseman showed, 4 in sight on his side of the jail, and probably as many more out of his vision. 8 cattlemen guarded the place from which he must take Lee Haines, and every one of the 8, he had no doubt, was a picked man. Dan pulled up Satan to a walk and commenced to whistle softly. It was like one of those sounds of the wind, a thing to guess at rather than to know, but the effect upon Satan and Black Bart was startling. The ears of the stallion dropped flat on his neck. He began to slink along with a gliding step, which was very like the stealthy pace of Black Bart, just stealing ahead. His footfall was as silent as if he had been shod with felt. Meantime, Dan ran over a plan of action. He saw very clearly that he had little time for action. Those motionless guards along the jail made his task difficult enough, but there was still greater danger. The crowds in those 2 saloons would be starting up the street for Haines before long. Their silence told him that. A clatter of hoofs came behind him. He did not turn his head, but his hand dropped down to the revolver butt. The fast-riding horseman swept and shot on down the street, leaving a pungent, though invisible, cloud of dust behind him. He stopped in front of Roger's house and darted up the steps and through the door. Acting upon a premonition, Dan dismounted a short distance from Roger's house and ran to the door. He opened it softly and found himself in a narrow hall dimly lighted by a smoking lamp. Voices came from the room to his right. "What do you mean, Hardy?" the deputy sheriff was saying. "Hell's starting." "There's a good many kinds of hell. Come out with it, Lee. I ain't no mind reader." "They's getting ready for the big bust." "What big bust?" "It ain't no use bluffing. Ain't Silent told you that I'm on the inside of the game?" "You fool," cried Rogers. "Don't use that name." Dan slipped a couple of paces down the hall and flattened himself against the wall just as the door opened. Rogers looked out, drew a great breath of relief, and went back into the room, and Dan resumed his former position. "Now talk fast," said Rogers. "About time for you to drop that rotten bluff. Why, man, I could even tell you just how much you've cost Jim Silent." Roger growled. "Tell me what's up." "The boys are going for the jail tonight. They'll get Haines and come string him up." "It's coming to him. He's played a hard game for a long time. And so have you, Rogers, for a damn long time." Rogers swallowed the insult, apparently. "What can I do?" he asked plaintively. "I'm willing to give Silent and his gang a square deal." "You should have done something while they was only a half-dozen cowpunchers in town. Now the town's full of riders and they're all after blood." "And my blood if they don't get Haynes," broke in the deputy sheriff. Hardy grunted. "They sure are," he said. "I've heard 'em talk, and the mean business. All of 'em. But how'd you answer to Jim Silent, Rogers? If you let 'em get Haynes, well, Haynes is Silent's partner, and Jim will bust everything wide to get even with you." "I can explain," said Rogers huskily. "I can show Silent how I'm helpless." Footsteps went up and down the room. "If they start anything," said Rogers, "I'll mark down the names of the ringleaders and give 'em hell afterwards. That'll soothe Jim some. You won't know 'em. They'll wear masks." Dan opened the door and stepped into the room. Rogers started up with a curse and gripped his revolver. "I never knew you were so fond of gunplay," said Dan. "Maybe that gun of yours would be catching cold if you was to leave it out in the leather very long." The sheriff restored his revolver slowly to the holster, glowering. "And Rogers won't be needing you for a minute or two," went on Dan to Hardy. They seemed to fear even his voice. The Wells Fargo agent vanished through the door and clattered down the steps. "How long you been standing at that door?" asked Rogers, gnawing his lip. "Just for a breathing space," said Dan. Rogers squinted his eyes to make up for the dimness of the lamplight. "By God," he cried suddenly, "you're Whistlin Dan Barry." He dropped into his chair and passed a trembling hand across his forehead. He stammered, "Maybe you've changed your mind and come back for that 5,000. "No, I've come for a man, not for money." "A man?" "I want Lee Haynes before the crowd gets him." "Would you really try to take Haynes out?" asked Rogers with a touch of awe. "Are there any guards in the jail?" "2, Lewis and Patterson." "Give me a written order for Haynes." The deputy wavered. "If I do it, I'm done for in this town." "Maybe. I want the key for Haynes' handcuffs." "Go over and put your hoss in the shed for the jail," said Rogers, fighting for time. "And when you come back, I'll have the order written out and give it to you with the key." "Why not come over with me now?" "I've got some other business." "In 5 minutes I'll be back," said Dan, and left the house. Outside, he whistled to Satan. The stallion trotted up to him. He swung into the saddle and rode to the jail. There was not a guard in sight. He rode around to the other side of the building to reach the stable. Still, he could not sight one of those shadowy horsemen who had surrounded the place a few minutes before. Perhaps the crowd had called in the guards to join the attack. He put Satan away in the stable, and as he led him into a stall, he heard a roar of many voices far away. Then came the crack of half a dozen revolvers. Dan set his teeth and glanced quickly over the half-dozen horses in the little shed. He recognized the tall bay of Lee Haynes at once, and threw on its back the saddle which hung on a peg directly behind it. As he drew up the cinch, another shout came from the street, by this time very close. When he raced around the jail, he saw the crowd pouring into the house of the deputy sheriff. He ran on till he came to the outskirts of the mob. Every man was masked, but in the excitement, no one noticed that Dan's face was bare. Squirming his way through the press, Dan reached the deputy's office. It was almost filled. Roger stood on a chair trying to argue with the cattleman. "No more talk, Sheriff," thundered one among the cowpunchers. "We've had enough of your line of talk. Now we want some action of our own brand. For the last time, are you going to order Lewis and Patterson to give up Haynes, or are you going to let 2 good men die fighting for a damn lone rider?" "What about the feller who's going to take Lee Haynes out to Elkhead?" cried another. The crowd yelled with delight. "Yeah, where is he? What about him?" Rogers, glancing down from his position on the chair, stared into the brown eyes of Whistlin Dan. He stretched out an arm that shook with excitement. "That feller there," he cried, "that one without a mask. Whistlin Dan Barry is the man." Well, that was a pretty good little story now, wasn't it? You come again next week, we'll do the same kind of thing, and we'll at least read you 3 more chapters of this here story. It's getting good. We're going to find out what they're going to do with this deal. We'll find out if Dan and Kate ever find a way back together. Gosh, until then, everybody, good night. Have a good one. This is Clay Steele.